what I'm interested in, just bringing a dimension to this now, Joe. So if we come back a stage, maybe that's not the right terminology, but we widen the picture, where do those new thoughts come from? Because they don't necessarily come from in here.
Great question.
It's almost like
Great question.
Coming from out here.
There's a couple ways that it happens, Ian. First way, if you wanted to take on the qualities and characteristics of Mahatma Gandhi, you would read his autobiography, or Churchill. You would want to know what is it about that person, character-wise or virtue-wise, that you adored or appreciated. So they accumulated knowledge. Every time we learn something new, we make new connections in the brain. So as they learned new things, they provided the raw materials to begin to organize a new ideal of self. The second thing that happens is that in the brain, the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. So when we begin to ask those type of questions, I call those frontal lobe questions, the newest and most evolved part of the brain, called the frontal lobe, finally wakes up and turns on. And because it has connections to all other parts of the brain, what it can do very well is it can take all of the knowledge we've intellectually learned and all the experiences that we've had, and it could seamlessly paste them together in a nonlinear way to reinvent a new idea. That's what invention is. So they began to use what they had semantically learned and through episodes and experiences learned and formulate a new idea. I love my Aunt Mary. My father was this way. I remember this experience I had. I remember the book I read on this person, and they began to organize a new set of neurons firing in new patterns in new ways. And so that's the second way. The third way is that the brain is both a sender and a receiver. So by asking those questions, the brain tunes into a stream of consciousness, and that stream of consciousness now gives them insights and gives them ideas about a better way to be, and that's the spiritual aspect of ourselves. So it's the combination of all those things, but the key is that they're single-minded. They're not letting go of the ideal. And as they're doing this in the reinvention process, those gangs of neurons now that are firing in new ways are reinforcing a new mind. And so the principle in neuroscience is nerve cells that fire together wire together. So as they're firing the same thoughts every single day, they're wiring a new set of circuits that would literally become the platform of their new self. So they're unlearning the old self, and they're relearning the new self. And change requires both. It requires breaking the habit of our repetitive thoughts and feelings and surrendering those, and then reinventing a new self, relearning a new self. And if we persist and we do it every single day, as I said earlier, it gets easier, because when you change the mind, you change the brain. And when the brain changes, then it changes the mind. So there's just a kind of a unifying principle that happens, that once we begin to get a little leverage and we get a little movement, you start noticing that the side effect of this process is you start to get happy, because you're no longer processing the same thoughts that are making you sick, right? Now, the research in neuroscience and biology right now tell us that we could actually change the brain by thinking, and that if we do it enough times, the body begins to respond ahead of the actual physical experience. And so if the brain and body begin to change ahead of the experience, it means then that the experience is actually happening. Which brings me to the fourth principle. When they were truly paying attention and truly focused, and they were rehearsing mentally this new ideal of themselves, they had long moments where they lost track of time and space.
Okay, now what does that mean in practice? They lost... What was again? The lost
track of
time. That sounds very esoteric. So
okay, so we do it all the time. You know, when you drive down the road in your car and you just drove, 50 kilometers or 60 miles, and you have no idea about the scenery that was passing. You weren't paying attention to the road. You weren't aware of your body.
But a lot of the time that's because I'm thinking.
They were actually thinking.
But isn't thinking normally has bad PR in these circles?
Okay, so good. So the technique of you spacing out while you're driving in your car, losing track of your body, not paying attention to the environment, and forgetting about time. Oh, you come back and you just realize, where were you? You just drove 50 kilometers and had no idea. Well, who's driving the car when that happens, right? But when we're truly paying attention and we're truly focused, the frontal lobe opens up a picture, and we begin to observe that picture. Now, most of us are thinking about our problems when we're driving in the car, and so we're reinforcing the circuitry of those problems. These people weren't doing that. They were thinking about a new way of life.
They were focused.
They were focused on a potential.
But they don't know exactly how they're going to get there, but I know you mentioned this as well, but they're focused on the result, or what they feel the result
They
will
were
be.
beginning to create a new ideal of themselves.
Right.
And in the process of doing that, according to functional brain scans, when we're paying attention, truly focused, there comes a moment when the frontal lobe turns on, and because it has connections to all other parts of the brain, the frontal lobe acts as a volume control, and it cools off the circuits in the brain that have to do with the body, feeling the body. It cools off the circuits, the strip that has to do with movement.
Yeah.
It cools off the circuits in the emotional centers. It cools off the visual cortex. It cools off all the other circuits so that nothing else is being processed.
Without being overridden in a way.
Right. The brain tunes out the environment, it tunes out the body, and it tunes out time. And the moment that that happens, the thought becomes the experience in that moment. And the moment the thought becomes the experience, the brain upscales its hardware and tracks the thought as an experience, and the circuitry changes.
Right.
Now, if there is no activity in the sensory cortex, or in the motor cortex, or in the emotional centers, or in the visual cortex, if the brain is no longer producing any activity there, then there is no mind there. So the parietal lobes that have to do with time and space, they cool off. And if they cool off, it's not like you're not thinking about time, there's just no time, because the mind isn't there to process time. That moment when that happens is an illustrious moment, because that's the moment that we have neurological and chemical changes that take place in the body, and the thought then is the experience. And the side effect of when that happens is we've just gone from living in a state of survival, run by those strong addictive chemicals, to a state of creation. And that's when, all of a sudden, when there is no body, and there is no thing, and there is no time, the side effect of that is people begin to experience a movement of energy. They start to feel joy. They start to feel lifted. And that new chemical response in the state of creation is the chemistry from the brain now that reconditions the body to a new mind. And all of a sudden, the body's getting a new chemical signal that's turning on new genes and turning off old genes, and they made their way. And the funny thing about it is when they were able to consistently do this, now, they began to look forward to it. It wasn't like, oh God, I gotta go do this. They were like, I can't wait, because when they got up, they felt better. They literally felt great.
Yeah.
And they reached a point after a period of time where they just said, I know that I'm healed. And, you know, everybody said, well, let's go get a test. And they said, well, I'll get a test, but I know that I know. Well, how do you know? I know that I'm better. They knew. They knew it on an intrinsic level.
They also felt better as well.
Oh, they also felt better,
Yeah.
but they knew.
And that's often the most encouraging thing. When you feel you're making tangible progress, that makes you even more encouraged to actually do.
Absolutely.
Do
The
what you're doing.
feedback